the Society of St. Pius X, when it was started in 1970, was started with ecclesiastical approval. It was fully 2 thumbs up, stamped, everything was legit. So the Society of St. Pius X, I think I kind of just always thought it as this like rebel movement that was always schismatic outside the church. No, not at all. This in 1970, 1971, the Society of St. Pius X. Now, there were some people who didn't like it, but it was legit. Am I right on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. The Society of St. Pius X had full canonical approval from 1970 to 1975. So the first 5 years of our existence, we had full canonical approval. And as I say, the Archbishop would never have founded the society if it did not get that canonical approval. Just because he would have known that he would not be doing the work of God. And for the Archbishop, that was absolutely necessary. As I say, the spirit of Father Lieberman, you don't direct events. You carefully follow the way God is directing you. Otherwise, it's just all a waste. In those first 5 years, when he had canonical approval, he had made the decision to stick with the 62 Missal, the traditional Mass. And he started to develop some enemies. People didn't like what he was doing, and especially in Rome, Cardinal Villot. Cardinal Villot was Secretary of State under Paul VI, and I think he wanted to find a way to take the Archbishop and the society down. Yeah. So what they did was they sent some visitors from Rome to do a canonical investigation of the houses, and you know that this has been done recently with the Franciscans of the Immaculate. You know, sometimes Rome will do this in a canonical visitation, and there were two representatives from Rome who came, and while they were there, they said some very scandalous things to the seminarians. Basically denying the resurrection of our Lord. I remember as one of the things. And the Archbishop was shocked. And he wanted to make clear to his seminarians that this was not what they wanted to be a part of. They didn't want to adhere to this sort of spirit where we just question everything in the faith. So in November of 1974, he issued a declaration. And his famous declaration where he just lays out that he wants to adhere to the tradition of the Church, the perennial teaching of the Church, and he wants to reject this modernist spirit that's going throughout the Church. So they couldn't fault his seminary, and there was nothing he really had against it. But they didn't like his declaration, and they effectively, in 1975, they told him to shut down. He made an appeal against this, and effectively, they did not give him the time of day. They didn't properly address his concerns. They didn't give him a due juridical process.
Yeah, that was shocking to read. You know, here's a prominent man who was a superior of a major order, an archbishop, and he makes an appeal, and they blew him off.
Yeah,
in Rome.
That just goes to show that there was a real abuse of power there, and the Archbishop understood that there's limits to power. So the Archbishop had a very great love for Rome and the Pope. So it very much pained him to recognize the fact that what was being done was an abuse of power, and the Pope was trying to force him to do things that would compromise the faith. In 1976, the Archbishop was suspended ad divinis. That's a censure that's inflicted on priests and prelates sometimes. It's basically saying it's a punishment where the Rome is saying you can't offer public mass anymore. You can't perform public sacraments anymore. And after that, Archbishop Lefebvre and Paul VI exchanged letters, and the Archbishop really wanted to speak directly to the Pope. And again, this is a sign of the goodwill of the Archbishop. And Cardinal Villot was trying to prevent him from meeting Paul VI, but eventually they were able to meet, and this was sort of an epic conversation between Paul VI And it was really eye-opening for the Archbishop, because when he went to see Paul VI, one of the first things Paul VI said to him is, "Why are you commanding your seminarians to take an oath against me?" And the Archbishop was shocked. He's like, "Holy Father, I would never do anything like that. I'm not against you. I don't ask the seminarians to take an oath against you." So these were just the calumnies that were being leveled against him. That he was just hated the Pope, and I think Paul VI might have been a bit sensitive to that. So Paul VI was getting the wrong message, and the Archbishop was saying to Paul VI, "Holy Father, please, just let us celebrate the traditional Mass. That's all that I ask. Just let us celebrate it." And Paul VI was wavering. He was almost ready to grant it, and then Cardinal Villot butted in, and he said, "If you grant them this Mass, then they'll make a banner of it. They'll make it them sort of like a separate party in the church." And so Paul VI said no. It's interesting. Even Jean Guiton, the close friend of Paul VI, said the same thing to Paul VI. He's like, "Just let them have the Mass. I mean, what's the big deal?" But the Archbishop recognized that he had a right to celebrate that Mass because it had never been abrogated. And it's very interesting that he'd been told year after year, "You can't say this Mass, you can't say this Mass." And then Benedict XVI sort of posthumously, approved Archbishop Lefebvre's position by saying that it hadn't been abrogated. And so, in fact, for all those years, he did have the right. The Archbishop was a master of these sort of reductio ad absurdum arguments, and he would point that out. How can what has formed so many saints? It has been good yesterday, all of a sudden becomes bad, and what I was taught that was holy and righteous and everything, now all of a sudden is wrong. It just doesn't make any sense. He wanted to look for some signs from divine providence. First of all, that the crisis of the church was as bad as it seemed. And so he looked for signs. He got two signs. One was the meeting in Assisi of John Paul II, where John Paul II in 86, where he gathered with all these different religions. And it was just a massive scandal of communicatio sacris. They're just there together, and leveling of all religions, the denial of the rights of Christ the King. And the Archbishop always had a very, very deep sense of the rights of God. And this is what ended up motivating Archbishop all throughout his life. He had to answer to God. There was this deep consciousness of the fact that he has to answer to God, and he has to protect the rights of God above everything else. And then the second sign that he received was he submitted certain questions, dubia. I think we're fairly familiar with the word dubia because of the four cardinals submitting dubia to Pope Francis, right? And these are questions that are submitted to the Pope, and it's basically asking the Pope, "Can you please clarify the teaching of the Church on a particular question?" So Archbishop Lefebvre submitted dubia to Rome on the question of religious liberty and separation of church and state. Does every individual person have the right to choose whatever religion he wants, or is there no right to choose whatever religion you want? You have a duty to choose the right religion. And the response he got from Rome was effectively against Catholic teaching. So those two things indicated to the Archbishop that the crisis of the Church was very severe. The traditional teaching was not being continued, and that he needed to continue his particular priestly society in order to maintain the traditional practices. And then at that point, he went to Rome and he said, "I would like to consecrate bishops. Can you please give me permission to consecrate bishops?" So on the one side, there's these two signs saying that you need to go forward. It's not going to come of itself. And on the other hand, he goes to Rome to ask permission for that.
Assisi 1986, for those that don't know, was a day of ecumenical peace and prayer with leaders and heads of various world religions, we might say idolatries. The most scandalous is, it's reported in the New York Times, there's photos, the Dalai Lama was there in Assisi, and they placed an idol of Buddha on an altar, on a tabernacle. It's kind of hard to tell on the picture. That definitely did happen. There are Native Americans smoking peace pipes in front of the Pope. And Archbishop Lefebvre and Bishop Castro Meyer issued this statement. I think it's in other places. I'm reading it. This is in Infiltration, but this is a statement by Lefebvre and Meyer. Public sin against the unicity of God, the Word incarnate, and His Church makes one shudder with horror. John Paul II has encouraged false religions to pray to their false gods. It is unprecedented and immeasurable scandal, and inconceivably impious and intolerable humiliation to those who remain Catholic, loyally professing the same faith for 20 centuries, end quote. This was, I mean, we think of the Pachamamas last October in 2019. This was that kind of a moment in 1986. A lot of us don't know that, but this was a huge scandal. And I kind of realized, oh, the 1988 consecrations, excommunications can only be understood as a response to the 1986 idolatry at Assisi. And by the way, that chapel where the Dalai Lama installed the idol of Buddha,
yes,
it collapsed in later on and was totally destroyed by an act of God.
So there's certain things that you can do as a Catholic that incur an automatic excommunication. And in the new Code of Canon Law, the consecration of bishops without apostolic mandate is one of them. However, canon law also indicates that if you believe that it's necessary, you don't incur that excommunication if you're not being flippant about it. But you know, to be honest, Taylor, that the interview that you had with Bishop Schneider the other day, asking him about the society was fantastic. Bishop Schneider just explained things so clearly with regards to the question of whether the society is schismatic or not. And he said then that, well, it's obvious the Archbishop is not schismatic. To be schismatic is to deny the authority of the Pope. That's the textbook definition of being schismatic. So if you think about the schismatic Orthodox, the whole thing is they refuse to recognize the Pope as being the head of the church. So did the Archbishop do that? Was he refusing to recognize the authority of the Pope? Well, no. He went to the Pope. He asked for the permission of the Pope to consecrate the bishops. He in the Mass where he consecrates, he commemorates the Pope. Yes. And he speaks of the Pope in the sermon. Yes. So there's no question of the Archbishop denying the authority of the Pope. That would be utterly abhorrent for the Archbishop. Absolutely impossible, metaphysically almost impossible for the Archbishop to deny the authority of the Pope. So it was just a practical decision based on, he said, I have to do this in order to continue my work, which is so necessary for the church. It's just basically very much a red herring to say that the society is schismatic, because there's no question of not recognizing the Pope, and we have the picture of Pope Francis in our chapels. We all say the name of Pope Francis in the canon of the Mass, so it's just not true. If he had not done those things, what sort of permission would there be to celebrate the traditional Mass? How many priests out there would be celebrating the traditional Mass? I mean, even a lot of the other traditional orders are derivatives of or breakoffs from the Society of St. Pius X. So it just, by the providence of God, he was the chosen instrument for the preservation of the traditions of the Church. And I think it's secure. They're not going to be lost. Yeah. But it would not have happened if he did not do what he did. Yeah. So Benedict says it was never abrogated. Lefebvre was right on that. He lifted the excommunications. I know the Society of St. Pius X doesn't like that language because they said that they never held. In the 1983 Code of Canon Law, if the person who is to receive the latae sententia excommunication is acting under fear, duress, necessity, or even if he feels like he is, which is kind of a weird thing to have in canon law, yes, the latae sententia excommunication does not apply to him. And obviously this is the case for Lefebvre. So, I mean, I'll go on camera and say I don't think Lefebvre was ever excommunicated.